as sometimes we have to negotiate on the policy. We heard that we define our liberation, we don't let other people define it for us, and that justice is not revenge. We heard that abolition is about dismantling and reimagining and growing, and that we don't want to sell out too easily to just dismantle, but insist that we are investing in growing communities. We heard that the spirit of the people is stronger than the violence of the state. We heard that advocacy without organizing will get us very little. And I can't do it, Cassandra, but I tried. We heard that that our struggle has to be about criminalizing, not just decarcerating. How did she put it? Yeah, decriminalize. But how did she put it? That it's not better to go from slavery to sharecropping. And we heard never say the word bracelets, say shackles.
Yeah.
So now we move on to our second panel. And we enter, the amazing thing about Beyond the Bars last night, Thursday night, last night, this morning, is that we start out bold and we get deep and stay bold. But we get deep into our contradictions. We rub up against where we don't exactly have consensus. And I think we're about to enter that terrain. We have a panel on electoral politics and social movements, intersectionalities and solidarities. And we are led by none other than Barbara Ramsey. Barbara Ramsey is the founder of the Black Radical Caucus, central to the movement for Black lives, an historian, a scholar, a longtime activist, and so much more. Barbara, you're on. Thank you.
I want to just, is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. I want to correct that a little bit. If you say the Black Caucus, you might think the Congressional Black Caucus, but I'm definitely not in. But Congress, yeah, the Black Radical Congress, which was, a whole different project. I'm so happy to be here. I was at a different place yesterday. I'll just leave it at that. Very different place, very different crowd. And I knew I was coming to see my people. So I was very excited that I would be affirmed, and I would learn, and I would be bolstered, and I would be fed in this space. And I just want to, just give a shout out to Beyond the Bars at age 10. Beyond the Bars for a decade. The theme is freedom plans, and it's freedom plans to match our freedom dreams. And I think we have to struggle on many different fronts. I'm always so inspired by folks who are directly impacted by this carceral state that we live under. People who the system has attempted to beat down, but who've come out fierce and fighting and leading and teaching. And that is so deeply inspiring. And we need to keep that in place in all of our movements, not just the movements, particularly around prisons and abolition, but abolition has to be the frame through which we see all of this work. Angela Davis and Ruthie Gilmore and others remind us, as the previous panel did, that abolition is not just about tearing down prisons, it's about building up, right? It's about building up our communities. And in my own way of viewing it, it's also about building alternatives to racial capitalism, because it's not rich people who are in jail, right? It's poor and working people who are in jails and prisons, and we have to weave that into our analysis as we live in this very, I think, proto-fascist moment where a lot of what people experience inside, people are going to be experiencing outside, right? And we have to understand that threat in all of its viciousness and seriousness. So on that note, I want to turn to my amazing panel. I was also very excited to be sitting up here with these folks. Rukia Lumumba is on her way. She's going to join us any moment now. But we have Rachel Gilmer, who is a Black feminist organizer with 10 years experience in various kinds of projects. She is one of the co-directors of the Fierce and Fighting Dream Defenders from Florida, doing all kinds of amazing work there. She has worked with the Portland African American Leadership Forum, many other things in her bio. But I always learn from Rachel as one of these uncompromising young activists who is at the forefront, always sharpening her understanding and our understanding, and pretty much fearless in the face of power. So we love you, and we're glad you're here. Next to Rachel is Chesa Boudin. Chesa is you want to say what's your title? It still sounds a little strange to say it, but against all odds, foregrounding his opposition to the prison industry, foregrounding his family's experience inside the prisons of this nation. He triumphed as the San Francisco District Attorney, one of the new. Before that, he was a public defender, went to Yale Law School. That's not as impressive as the work you're doing now, but really committed to reform and justice, and really trying to, I think, balance, and we're going to talk about that, of what does it mean to be an outsider within? What does it mean to do that inside work with principle and integrity? To my immediate right, but really always to my left, is my brother Mo Mitchell, who is the current director of the national director of the Working Families Party. And before that, Mo was was organizing on the streets of Ferguson, was one of the founders of the Movement for Black Lives, has done enormous work around electoral politics, but also organizing in our communities, and really is given new leadership, direction, inspiration to electoral justice work through the Working Families Party, and I think is gonna teach us a lot today and inspires me always. So welcome, Mo, to the panel. And I'll introduce Rukia when she arrives, but Rukia Lumumba is, of course, doing work in Mississippi, is somebody who has been a lawyer and worked on the Chokwe Lumumba mayoral campaign, which was successful, and also with the National Conference of Black Lawyers, doing a lot of work in New York for many years around freeing our young people from these cages. But hopefully she'll be joining us in just a minute. That's right. Okay. Right. And I didn't get your name though. Estadas. Okay. So before we get started, to kick us off, the title of Rukia, yay! Somebody did some fantastic driving to get you here. Come on up, and you right here. Let me just give Rukia a proper introduction. So, founder and director of the People's Advocacy Institute. She has been involved in transformative justice work as a strategist and a community organizer for more than 18 years. People with these long resumes, and then they look so youthful. That's nice. The struggle keeps you young. Especially as it relates to criminal justice disparities for people of color. She has been the director of two of New York State's largest criminal justice nonprofits cases, the Center for Alternative Sentencing and Employment Services and the Center for Community Alternatives. She graduated of Howard Law School and is doing some amazing work right now in Mississippi, trying to fight to close that vicious Parchman prison, which has caged so many of our people over the years. So thank you for being here. So what I'm going to do now, you know that this panel is a panel that's talking about electoral justice work, electoral politics and social movements, intersections, contradictions, and freedom struggles 2020. So we're going to talk about how do we struggle on different fronts? How do we navigate that balance between what's a principle and unprincipled compromise, right? And some of the inspiring lessons from the last panel can guide us there. How do we support people who get in positions of limited and conditional power and allow them and support them and push them to leverage that power for what we want and need? So these are the questions. They're difficult questions, right? There's not just a sweet solution, but it's a challenge upon us. So we want to do that. We want to start off with Brother Jaime Estrada, who's going to talk to us about voter suppression. Because as much as we talk about elections, right, if you go and your vote doesn't count, it's kind of a moot point, right? So electoral justice work is one part of a larger struggle. Voter suppression is really, one of the cutting edge issues within that electoral justice arena. So we have an expert here who's going to share with us for about 7 minutes, some of the landscape, some of what we're up against, and then we'll lead right into the panel. So welcome, Jaime. I'm sorry I didn't have a full bio.
No, don't worry.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. This is beyond bars, but this is against the wall. You know what I'm talking about.
Up against the wall.
So I have 7 minutes. I think it will take 8. So what I decided was that I was going to have some bullets instead of have a narrative, and that way I can do it faster. So if I pass 7, is because I passed 7.
I'll let you know.
Okay, first bullet. Bullet number 1. The word democracy is not in the U.S. Constitution. The founders debated this and clearly decided that majorities could not be trusted. Therefore, they decided against having a democracy to undermine the power of the majority, who they believed to be extremely uneducated. That was their excuse, that they're uneducated, we know better. Bullet number 2. By excluding slaves under the 3/5 constitutional concept, the founders also created, and this is important, they also created a preferential treatment for themselves, for white males, thus creating the first affirmative action program in the Constitution of the United States, but for white people. Bullet 3, by federalism. The drafters didn't include the words right to vote in the Constitution of the United States until the 14th and the 15th Amendment. That's the first time that is mentioned, but not in the original Constitution of 1787. But gave power, and basically they gave the power to the states in order to regulate the vote. Since the voter suppression has been an intrinsic part of the United States culture, therefore it begs the question, and this is for the panel: is voting a right or a privilege? Bullet 4, Pericles, the father of democracy in Athens. He says, democracy is the administration that must favor the many instead of the few. This is why it's called democracy. Bullet 5. Today in the United States, democracy is not at the service of equality, wider distribution of wealth, or the preservation of social welfare, since real democracy tends to regulate the market for the benefit of the whole. Real democracy. Thus, every election in the United States has become, in essence, after we go after all the layers, in essence, every election is a debate between laissez-faire, represented by the Republican Party, and a minor regulation of the market represented by the Democrats. Minor regulation. It's my opinion, that this debate that we have today, Sanders, Biden, I believe, this is me, that Democrats would rather keep Trump than to have Sanders as a socialist. So, bullet number 6, the deregulation of the economy and the regulation of democracy work hand in hand. Examples: increased rights to corporations like Citizens United Decision. I know the panels are going to touch on that. And Hobby Lobby. Hobby Lobby, 33,000 employees. The Supreme Court of the United States, nobody talks about Hobby Lobby. Hobby Lobby, 33,000 employees, owned by a couple. They own the whole company. And the Supreme Court of the United States said that they have religious rights, that small corporations have religious rights. Not only Citizens United corporations are now people, but now they have religious rights. The next step is basically that they are going to become a church. Wait for that one. And it's not because they are religious, not because they believe in God, they don't care about those things, they believe in money, but it's because they are going to get taxes free. So, but Hobby Lobby is interesting because it's 33,000 employees, and the Supreme Court says that it's a small business, mom and pops. 33,000 employees, mom and pops. I have never seen a bodega like that. You know, with mom and pops, the cats running all over the food. Bullet number 7. SCOUS voting suppression at the Supreme Court, SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States voting suppression decisions since 2011, voter ID laws, partisan gerrymandering just a couple of months ago, saying that basically now you can create district in a partisan way, and that's part of the political culture of the United States according to the decision. Therefore, you can discriminate. There is no one vote, one person concept anymore based on that decision. You cannot discriminate in terms of race, but partisan, in terms of Democrats and Republicans and others, they can discriminate. Weakening the Voting Rights Act, that the Shelby decision, Shelby versus Holder, I'm sure that that is going to be discussed today. The Purging of Voters, that's another decision that took place in 2016, and since then, you know Stacey Abrams? 1.3 million people in Georgia were purged from the voters' rolls. And the one who was counting the votes was the one running against her. And the one who did the purging was the one running against her. And nobody says because Shelby was basically eliminated, the Voting Rights Act has been diminished because the Shelby decision. No one went after him and said, you cannot run. You either run or resign to the position. And he won. He's now the governor. He's not supposed to be the governor of Georgia in any way. Former felons, Florida. 1 minute left. Florida, 1.7 former felons in Florida gained the right to vote. Jim Crow law, one of the oldest one, through a referendum in Florida. Immediately after they won, imagine, Trump won by 40,000 votes, Florida. 1.7 new voters, mostly black and brown. That changed Florida forever. Immediately they went to the legislature in Florida, and they said that now they have to pay a tax because they have to pay fees that they had to pay when they were in prison. That's a poll tax. So recently the ACLU took the court to appellate court. They won, but only for 17 of them, not for everybody. Now, let me one more bullet and then I leave with this. Texas, they closed 750 poll sites during the last year. However, this is the good news. Last week, the past Tuesday, nearly 2.1 million Texans voted in the state's primary. That is 64,000 more people that voted than voted in 2016. Even with 750 poll sites being closed. That's good news. The people at the end is going to win. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jaime. So now we're gonna, that was a good setup for our conversation. I'm not sure if we're gonna cover everything that you challenged us to cover, but we will attempt, and I think it's a good segue to start with Rachel Gilmer, because Rachel was one of those organizers in Florida fighting for expansion of democracy, right? And still fighting, right? So Rachel Gilmer.
Well, hey everyone.
Hey.
Thank you so much for having me. I was really inspired by the panel previously and just really, really grateful to be here. So Dream Defenders was founded in 2012 after the murder of Trayvon Martin. Black and immigrant youth came together to basically demand justice around his murder. And when George Zimmerman was acquitted, we took over the Florida Capitol for 31 days and 30 nights, really trying to push for what we were calling Trayvon's Law, which was basically a suite of legislation around racial justice. And in this moment, Dream Defenders really kind of surged into the national spotlight. I mean, we had some of our members were going on MSNBC. We had celebrities coming to the Capitol. We were, really in the public spotlight with lots of people, showing their solidarity. But at the end of the day, what we realized through that experience was despite being very kind of popular, we actually didn't have the power we needed to win the things we were trying to win. And, being in the halls of the Florida Capitol we saw, Florida has been run by Republicans for the past 20 years. We have one of the, the biggest, highly resourced Republican parties in the country. The Koch brothers invest more money into Florida than anywhere else. We have one of the most conservative Democratic parties in the country. And so what we really saw was that those were the people with power. And so Dream Defenders, very early on in the kind of DNA embedded in our organization through this experience, was really this focus on what does it look like to build a Florida in our image? What does it look like to build political power independent from the two-party system for Black and immigrant youth? So when we left the Capitol, we made this announcement around we were going to register 50,000 voters, which was basically the win margin that Rick Scott, the governor at the time, had won by. So we made this big announcement. We didn't do that. We just didn't have the organizational, we were very ambitious, but didn't have the organizational infrastructure to do it. And through that experience, we also saw basically there was because Florida is such an important state nationally in national politics, lots of money flows in around elections, but not lots of money flows in to help organizations long-term build independent power. And so our members, when we really didn't get our organization wasn't being given resources to do that long-term power building, we were just being given money to do stuff around elections. Our members were like, we're done with funders dictating the direction of our organizations. All the politicians are the same. We're really not gonna focus on electoral politics anymore. And we sort of swung into this opposite pendulum of we're just gonna focus on building alternatives outside the state. But then Trump won, and we realized that we couldn't leave elections off the table. And so we really settled on what does it look like to build a dual power strategy. Our political vision, you can find it on our website, is called the Freedom Papers. It's a socialist abolitionist vision for the future. Right. And we're really focused on moving this vision through building political power inside the state, using elections. We need people who are aligned with our vision in government. Building power outside the state, those people aren't going to be able to move anything on their own. We have to actually pressure them once they get elected by having masses of people out in the streets organizing. And then also build power completely outside the state by building alternative institutions. We're actually really excited. We're currently launching a transformative justice center in the coming month. So is that?
No, half more minute.
Okay, no, that's fine. So yeah, so we've been engaging in electoral politics and all the contradictions that come with that. In 2018, we were a part of the Amendment 4 win. We endorsed a candidate for the first time, Andrew Gilmer for governor, who would have been the first Black governor, the only non-millionaire who was running for governor at the time. And this year, our membership endorsed Bernie Sanders. But really looking forward to being in this conversation because definitely the more and more we've stepped into electoral politics, the more and more we're holding all the contradictions that come with that.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. She could have said more if I hadn't cut her off. I'm sorry about that. So we're going to have each, and also they're not going to let me moderate again because I forgot to start us off with the question. She knew the question, but you didn't know the question. So the question is that most of these folks come from organizing backgrounds. Chaser was a public defender, but other people come from grassroots organizing backgrounds and have shifted to invest some of their energies into electoral work. And the question was, why and how have you done that? She answered that question. And we're going to lead with Black women, and we're going to lead with the South. So we go from Rachel talking about Florida, and we're going to move to Rekia Lumumba, who's going to tell us a little bit about Mississippi in about 4 minutes or so.
Okay.
And then we'll move to discussion.
All right. Hey, everybody.
Hey.
Free the land. Yes, free the land. Free the land. What we say, by any means necessary. So I am really thankful to be here on this panel today. So I come from the political home of what I call the Malcolm X grassroots movement. I don't call it, that's what it is. And so I am also the executive director of the People's Advocacy Institute, and I am blessed to have the opportunity to co-lead the Electoral Justice Project of the Movement for Black Lives with Jessica Bird and Kayla Reed, which I'm really excited to share that space with, and with many people here on the panel. So when I talk about electoral work, I start with Mississippi because that's where we entered this work. When my family moved down to Mississippi in the late 1980s, actually from New York, right after the trial of Mutulu Shakur and Marilyn Buck, when we saw two loved ones go into prison to serve sentences that literally condemned them to life. You know, my father said, I'm going to continue to fight. I'm going to move south, and we're going to free the land where we said we were going to free it and create a new community that is based on human rights, based on human beings having human conditions and the material needs they need to survive and thrive. So back in 2006 or 2005 when, actually in 2005 when Katrina happened, what we realized is that as we were helping to restore the lives of our people in the homes in our cities, what we recognized is that we didn't actually have the political power to actually meet the material needs of our people in the first place. And so we had been talking all of this theory around what it meant to be free, and we hadn't began to experiment with what does it mean to actually have the power to control the resources that get our people what they need to actually feel what freedom is. And so what we decided in 2006 is that through people's assemblies, these assemblies models that has been going on across the nation and across the world for decades. I mean, assemblies were what helped govern our lands and our communities when we were enslaved as Africans here on this country, on this continent, and in this country. And so we went back to that model of how our ancestors on the plantation began to organize themselves around collectively understanding what does it mean when we decide how the little bit of land that we can control in the fields, right? Not in the fields, but in the slave quarters. And I'm trying to rush because I only got 4 minutes. But what does it mean to actually use that model to begin to determine how we govern in our hyperlocal spaces? So in our neighborhoods, but also in our cities and then in our states. And so that's where we began the struggle. And so after Katrina, we held a people's assembly. And through that people's assembly, we developed a people's agenda. And that people's agenda said that my father needed to run for city council. And initially, they said he needed to run for mayor. They said, we are choosing you to run for mayor because we know that you will represent us and control the resources in the right way, and that you won't do it by being that leader at the top, but instead you will always have this understanding that you must come to us for the answers to how to solve those problems. And so what we did is in 2006, instead of running for mayor, he ran for city council, right? Weren't quite ready to run for mayor. It was hard enough to convince him to run for city council. He won by over 88% of the vote. And through his council victory for Ward 2, which is the ward we grew up in, he held people's assemblies consistently. And through those assemblies, he gained more and more information and direction from the people of what needed to happen. In 2010, for the first time in Jackson, Mississippi's history, we were able to pass a human rights ordinance that said that the police and other state officials that came into Jackson did not have a right to arrest or detain people based on the color of their skin, their nationality, or the fact that they thought they might be an immigrant, right? And a whole number of things. And a whole number of things we were able to pass. And so the people said, now we're ready for you to run for mayor 4 years later. So he ran for mayor, and in 2013, he became mayor by 85% of the vote. He passed away 8 years within his period of time, but the manner of hope, the understanding of our right as a people to actually govern was not lost by the people of Jackson. And so what we saw is that when my father would go into the assemblies and make big decisions around big decisions that needed to be made. For example, one of those decisions was around, well, what is it that we were faced with this understanding of, do we tax ourselves? A 1% sales tax to help fix the infrastructure, and I have a minute left. That was our failing infrastructure. We have horrible infrastructure. If you ever come to Mississippi, people, the first thing you'll complain about are the potholes. But the other thing that people complain about is the sewage and the water and how we're living in conditions that we need to figure out a better way to control our water systems and things like that. And so 1% sales tax to help fix the infrastructure problem. And as an organizer, we were against it. But through the assemblies, the people said, my father entered the room and he said, well, how should I vote? And they said, well, we believe that we should tax ourselves 1%. We believe that we should tax ourselves 1% because we believe that that's going to help our infrastructure problem. And that's where the people were, and that's what we need to do. But that wasn't the only time that he walked to the people. He did that consistently. And because of that, when my brother ran for mayor 5 years later, what we saw was that the people voted for him by 95% of the vote. And so he's mayor currently right now. But I think it's important to understand that he's mayor right now and that his decision to endorse a candidate came from a process that we created through the assembly, right? And that was taken broader through our work with the Electoral Justice Project of the Movement for Black Lives, where we took the issues that people were dealing locally in their community, used an assembly model to move people to understand the issues and the agendas that the candidates, the presidential candidates, were pushing forward. And in most of those cases, we did it anonymously, so people could decide and choose who they wanted to vote for based on the issues and the agenda and not on the personality of the candidate. And overwhelmingly in over 20 cities, what we saw, including in Jackson, Mississippi, is that our people chose the most progressive candidates that were on the agenda, period. And that's important because through that process, my brother also recognized his responsibility to then endorse a candidate based on what the people said. And so based on that, he chose who to endorse based on the decisions of the People's Caucus. I don't know if I can say who that was, but
Okay. And didn't he announce it?
he announced it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So it's public, so it doesn't matter. I don't know, like the
We
C3,
know.
C4, decisions. And so through that caucus, the people chose Sanders, and so he endorsed Sanders, and you can hear that. There were several other caucuses, but overwhelmingly, both times, Sanders and Warren, those were the two choices, period, that our people chose, and they chose it based on agenda and issues. And so we entered this work because it was necessary to enter the work to begin to understand how we can control the resources. That's why I do it.
Great.
Thank you.
Great.
Sorry.
Great. No. We're getting into this. I think what we're hearing is, yes, electoral, and later maybe Rukia will say a little bit more about the caucuses, the Electoral Justice Project, different approaches to electoral work, different candidates. We're not about being cheerleaders for candidates, right? But building a different approach to the electoral work so people are indeed held accountable. So we do focus on issues, not saviors and celebrities and that kind of thing. So segue to Mo Mitchell, who thinks about this night and day. I know because I get texts from him late at night and early in the morning. So he has been working very hard in the Working Families Party to build it, to change it, to make it more robust around racial justice work, and thinking about this particular electoral season. So how did you go from being an organizer on the streets of Ferguson after the rebellion to being the head of the Working Families Party and doing this electoral justice work?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Ransby, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I think that journey for me started a lot earlier. So as a college student at Howard University, my entry into direct action came after the police murder of Prince Jones, who was one of our classmates. And from there, I led a sort of like a dual tactic sort of organizer's life where I stayed committed to the tactics of direct action and movement organizing, and also developed some rigor around some of the tactics of sort of traditional community-based, issue-based organizing. And when I eventually came to Long Island and I worked with people like Barbara Allen, maybe more than a decade ago, I think maybe like 15 years ago, on work to prevent the Suffolk County Jail from expanding, and we successfully created an intervention in order to do that. At the same time that I was doing that type of organizing, I was also a grassroots member of Critical Resistance and a member of Malcolm X Grassroots People's Self-Defense Campaign, right? And so there's always this opportunity to utilize all the tools and engage in all the various fronts of the struggle. And that work led to getting involved in electoral work because there were limitations to the hyper-local, and there were limitations that were mainly political limitations that led to just some really deep contradictions that couldn't be resolved by only working on very, very hyper-local work. Fast forward to the work that we did through the Movement for Black Lives. So I, like many, many people around the country, were inspired by the uncommon courage of everyday working class Black folks in St. Louis and in Ferguson through that uprising, which really gave Black people around the world permission to experiment and act in new ways politically, and some folks to be politically Black for the first time, right? Which I think is still a lasting contribution the folks who sort of set the fire on the ground there. So I was called into action through their uncompromising example, and through the work there, one of the things that I came away with, and many of our comrades came away with, was that social movements, when they're at their most effective, they render the impossible possible. So they provide opportunities for us to look at solutions that otherwise we haven't looked at, and they also sort of render the invisible visible. So the experiences that Black folks have every single day, but were largely in obscurity, those experiences were not news. And social movements are able to draw a spotlight at those things, render them visible, and then put into relief those contradictions. Now, when we put into relief those contradictions require, or, sort of require a resolution, and the questions that they bring up require answering. And the thing that I recognized was that, like, social movements and our tactics are best at doing that. However, the most organized forces in our society are best at resolving those contradictions and answering those questions, because nature doesn't like vacuums. And so, for example, we put into relief these contradictions around state violence against Black folks, and then quickly, within months, the answer was Taser International and body cameras, right?
Yeah.
So, and then this sort of two-step is something that you see all around the world. So from the Arab Spring, where a united front that included leftists and included students and included all forces were able to topple entrenched power, but the folks who are most organized, right, were able to fill that vacuum, right? So it's actually really important for us as we engage in these tactics and sometimes successfully are able to topple entrenched power, that we consider not simply the checkers game, but the chess game. So what's the second step? And what are the forces, the organized forces that could answer the questions that we pose or resolve the contradictions that we put into relief? And that's actually what brought me to being very interested in governing power. After the Trump election, I, like many people, I was shocked. I wasn't prescient enough to see that the Trump victory was coming. I was shocked and I was disturbed, and humbly, I recognized that we needed to invest in different tools. We needed to invest in the tools of governance so that we could have folks who would be aligned with us in order to be able to resolve the contradictions. And we had to think about what co-governance actually looked like. And, to me, when I think about co-governance currently, we are in a co-governance relationship with capital, right? So that's currently what's already happening. So it's not whether or not we introduce co-governance, it's like, how do we create a model where folks that we elect are in a co-governance relationship with the people, right? That, to me, is the question. And I think one of the things we need to do is, like, we need to begin to challenge ourselves to believe that we should and can be in power, and not be simply insistent on being the opposition. And the best example I could give is that like Steve Miller and Steve Bannon, they had a dream, and only a few years ago, in right-wing circles, their ideas were niche, and nobody thought that they could actually engage in governance. They and their ideology basically run federal policy. So if those aggressively mediocre white men could do that successfully, if we allowed ourselves to believe that we could actually be in governance roles, what could we do?
That's right.
Right? And that would also, and once we do that, then we could totally refigure what the relationship between the state and the people are. But we need to, the first step is to take power.
That's right.
And so we can't be afraid of taking power. We can't be, and we also have to be non-delusional about power.
That's right.
Which means recognizing the amount of power, the type of power we have, and then figuring out how we build So, for example, I'll just give one example. So I took over the helm of the National Working Families Party a little bit more than a year ago, and we've been aggressively from the ground up rethinking what the Working Families Party can do and using it as a tool to answer the questions I just posed. And so one experiment that we did was we ran not a Democrat, but a Working Families Party third-party candidate, Kendra Brooks, in Philly, and we won. It's historic. It hasn't. It's a major city where we have an independent, working class Black woman who now sits on city council and was opposed by both the Democrats and the Republicans, who joined in a united front against her, right? And so our theory is that if we build power consistently, because what we're experiencing, Trumpism, is the outcome of a 4 or 5 single-sided, very, very resourced strategy by Koch brothers and other anarcho-capitalists who developed the capacities to be able to get to where we are, right? And so if we're going to be non-delusional about building the capacities to govern seriously, then we need to build the infrastructure. So candidates and candidate campaigns and elections are simply opportunities for movement building for me and for infrastructure, which is why I focus on party building. And the Kendra Brooks campaign is an example of that. So following Kendra's election, Kendra is now in a co-governance relationship with the folks who got her there, which wasn't organized capital, weren't the Democrats, weren't the Republicans. It was a coalition of folks. And Kendra brought Bernie folks and Warren folks together. Kendra brought labor and community folks together. Kendra brought everyday working class Black folks as well as white intellectual leftists together. And those folks are now committed to supporting and flanking Kendra. I think it's important too, when we get our people in office, we need to rethink sort of the tactics that we've used in the past around accountability. If these are in fact our folks, right, then we have to engage with them in very different ways and not simply use the punitive tactics of accountability. We actually need to flank our people. We need to flank our folks once they get into office. And this is another WFP endorsed candidate. We have to flank our folks and struggle with our folks because there are contradictions that exist within governance, especially in legislative bodies. And we have to also have an education around, like, elected officials are not direct action organizers. And so their tactics will look different. And politics are about compromise. The questions are, who experiences the upside and the downside of those compromises? That is actually the question, not whether or not you make those compromises. And who is in a democratic relationship in order to decide that, right? Are policy folks, people in organized capital, or working class people who make those decisions? That's right. All right, thanks.
Right, great. So many issues. And, I just, I know the audience has comments and questions, but we're gonna have the fourth panelist make some comments. Chesa Boudin, a district attorney for San Francisco, who moved from being a public defender to run for office, who won against predictions, in some ways against the odds, right, and is now dealing with being an elected official, having movement expectations, and hopefully feeling flanked. But how did you make the decision to go into this work, Chesa, and why do you think it's important?
Well, thank you, Barbara. And let me just say it's an honor to go last on this panel. And I mean that. I mean that because the people on this panel and the people in this room are folks who I've been inspired by, who I've received support from, and who I hope and expect to be held accountable to going forward. It's really important, to talk the idea about flanking, the idea about movement building, the dialectic between what's happening in the community and what's happening in public office is essential. We cannot elect people, no matter who they are, not me, not anybody, and then say we won. All we want is an opportunity. That's all we want. And I can't possibly take advantage of that opportunity without you holding me accountable, without you flanking me, without you continuing to generate ideas and build alternatives to jails and prisons, because they don't exist in the quantity and in the capacity that we need them right now. But let me back up for a minute. I loved being a public defender. I loved it. I saw my work as a public defender as standing up and stepping up for people in a moment of crisis, people who were facing horrific, extreme consequences for things that in some cases they were responsible for, in other cases they were wrongfully accused of, and in every case was a product of a really failed social system. I love that work. I love the moral clarity of saying, you are my client. I am fighting for you. And my ethical obligation is to do what's right for you. That's all I care about. The job I have now is a lot more complicated. It's a lot murkier, right? I represent the people. A lot of people in my role don't think that the people include those they're prosecuting. So I'm clear on that much. But I never wanted to run for office. And I didn't want to run for office for a lot of the reasons we heard the last panel talk about, because of the compromise, right? Because of the mucky, disgusting policymaking process. The moral clarity of being a public defender was safer, it was easier, it was firm, steady ground. But I found myself, and I think we all find ourselves, in a pretty unique historic moment. It's the first time in any of our lifetimes when there's a broad national consensus that what we're doing in the so-called criminal justice system is not working for anybody. It's not keeping us safe. It's not healing or restoring victims. It's certainly not rehabilitating people. It's not an effective use of our resources, whether it's 1% or in California 10% of our state budget that goes just to the prison system. And even people on the far right, even Donald Trump, is claiming the mantle of criminal justice reform. And now we all know the baby step. I mean, the First Step Act was not enough and did not get us even close to where we need to be. But it tells us something important about the moment that we're in. It tells us that everybody, left, right, center, recognizes we need a new approach. And we need to be at the table deciding what that approach looks like. We need to be there organizing people like me out of a job.
That's right.
And so when I found my city, the city where I practice law, where I've been a public defender for years, in its own unique moment, right? We have this national context, and then for the first time in 110 years, the San Francisco district attorney race had no incumbent. 110 years. And that's a whole other conversation. As lawyers like to say, we'll drop a footnote and talk about that later. But the reality is district attorneys run unopposed. They run as incumbents and they win as incumbents. And in San Francisco, that's been true for 110 years. When there's a handoff, it's orchestrated, it's arranged. The mayor appoints the replacement, right? And they tried to do that in the middle of my race because they saw that the movement that was getting me elected was winning. So we had this moment, we had this opportunity. And so I decided to do something that I didn't really want to do. I decided to give up a job that I loved to take on a job that I didn't know what to expect. And then we won. Thanks to support from so many of you. And now I face the slippery slope of compromise every day, right? And I face the slippery slope of forgetting the full humanity of the people who are referred to as defendants in every single one of the 5,500 open cases my office has prosecuted. 20% of which are more than 2 years old. So I want to just say very briefly a few of the things we've been able to do. I've been in office less than 2 months. It'll be 2 months on Monday. And I want to just kind of say a few of the things that I'm proud of, and hopefully we'll have time to unpack the challenges, the compromises, the shortcomings of actually implementing those policies. Because it's one thing for me to say, this is what we're doing. It's another thing for people that work for me, the 300 employees in my agency, to actually do, and especially to follow through on the spirit of those policies, right? But one thing is we have about 120 lawyers. I've now hired or given job offers to more than 10 former public defenders. So we're shaping the culture, we're changing the narrative about what we do, who we are, and making sure, thank you, making sure we bring people into the office who don't just theoretically know that the person they're prosecuting is a three-dimensional human being with a family and a community and hopes and dreams and a future that's more than their worst mistake, but also people who've done that work, who've seen those cases, who've seen racial profiling and what it looks like in a police report, who've seen people who are wrongfully accused and the way that so-called forensic science can contribute to false confessions and false convictions. That's one thing we've done. Another thing we've done is we created the first in the state and maybe the first in the country diversion program for primary caregiver parents. And there are people who say, well, what if you have a co-defendant, two people accused of the same crime, and one is a parent and the other is not? I mean, that seems like it's so arbitrary. You point me to a place in the criminal justice system where the quality of justice is not arbitrary. You point me to one place, juvenile, 17 and a half, 18. My father serving 75 years to life for the same thing my mother did 22 years for. You point me to a place where our system's not arbitrary. And I'll tell you what, if we're serious about public safety, we all know that we're safer when parents are at home taking care of their kids than when they're in a cage. But we didn't stop there. We didn't stop with those policies, right? In our first 2 months, we've done a couple other things that were controversial, but that were inspired by something that Angela Davis, who I'm proud to see in the room, I'm honored to see her here, taking time to listen to this panel, says, well, give it up for Angela. It is not enough to say I'm not a racist. I must be anti-racist. And what does that mean in my current job, right? So that's something I think about every day, that I grapple with, because so much of the racism in the criminal justice system is everywhere, right? It's not just one place, it's not just one policy, it's not just one person or decision maker. And we see in San Francisco especially, so much of the racism start with policing, start in the community. And it's really easy for us in my office to say, well, we got this police report, and sure, we know that there's racial bias in how resources are distributed, but look at the facts of the case. I mean, regardless of the skin color, we could be race blind and still amplify and perpetuate the racial bias of police officers who are not race blind when they choose who to arrest and what to arrest them for. And so we did a couple things. We said we're not going to punish people for status enhancements. We're not going to use status enhancements, who you are, gang enhancements, 3 strikes, abolished. No more strike priors. And we said, the police in San Francisco stop African-American drivers. Driving while black is it more of a risk in San Francisco than in any other major city in the state of California. African-Americans are disproportionately more likely to be stopped and searched in San Francisco than any other city in the state. And that's not a new statistic. That was true when the ACLU reviewed 50,000 traffic stops in 2002. It was true when the Obama Department of Justice published a report about the San Francisco Police Department, highlighting more than 200 urgently needed reforms to bring that department in line with basic racial justice and legal principles. And those changes haven't been made. So here we are 4 years later, and now I'm in office, and those changes have not been made. And we say, we're not going to prosecute stop and frisk cases. We're not going to prosecute cases where the police stop someone for driving or biking or walking while black and search them consensually without probable cause and give us a case and say prosecute. We say no.
So now we want to have some back and forth conversation on the panel, and then we'll turn to you. And I think we have till 12:50. Okay. Mo said this thing, we can be in power, and we can engage in co-governance, and what does that mean? And then Chesa raises a question of what kind of changes can happen once you're elected. And I just want to push us a little bit to think about that very difficult question. For example, Chokwe Arntan Lumumba is a mayor of, and he said he wants it to be the most radical city in America. But in the belly of the beast of Southern racism, Mississippi, where my people come from, that's a challenge. We don't just say, here's our freedom agenda, and they all fall in line. That would be nice, but that doesn't happen. Do we have to change structures in order to leverage power? What are the dangers of going into structures designed to keep us in control, right? And we've heard that throughout the past panel, and to be making compromises. What's our criteria? What's our North Star? What are the critical questions, critical things that have to change in order for us to move toward a different kind of system, right? And I know that's a big question, and we have some big brains up here. I'm reminded of, I come from Chicago, and we elected 6 socialists to city council. We have 50. They're 6 out of 50. So, so they're outnumbered, but they're doing things and they're pushing, what are the things we can do? And I don't want to add that condition of realistically, practically. These are the things that walk us back from our freedom dreams, right? What can we do boldly? How can we recalibrate what progress and winning means in any given situation, which I'm convinced sometimes it might mean losing an election, right? And you may win some forward motion on movement building, but that's not the goal, but sometimes that happens. So I gave you all a heads up about this question, like, how are we navigating what it means to have an outsider within strategy? How do we retain our principles and politics in that? And how does a strategy become long-term fundamental change as opposed to short-term baby steps? And I'm gonna take notes.
Okay.
Because I want to know the answer.
So I'll start. I think there's a few things we should consider. So not all elected offices are made the same. There are executive offices and then there are legislative offices. So I think what was that? And judicial, true, and judicial. And so one of the things I think we should be thinking about is where are the opportunities for us to take executive power? Because from jump, like has been proven here, folks who have executive power could immediately make decisions day one, right? And so the more radical executives, the more radical decisions our people could see. One of the challenges is that when we get people into legislative positions, like if it's like a 6-50 situation, people do all of this work, and then sometimes it could lead to cynicism because they don't see immediate results. And so how are we doing the political education in order for people to be able to understand the distinctions there? So that's just one thing, thinking about like when you have a DA or a sheriff or a mayor or a governor or a president, the executive power that they could wield immediately. The other thing is that when we do get people in legislative roles, what are the non-reformist reforms that we're really pushing for, and what are the first and most essential reforms? And I think they need to be structural reforms. So there needs to be a host of reforms that we as a movement agree are the structural reforms that will constrain the power of organized capital and expand the power of our people, of organized people, which is what the far right has done. Whenever they get folks into legislative bodies and have enough power, they focus on the structural reforms. They focus on reforms that limit democracy and advance the power of the very wealthy and corporations. And so we have to have our set of consistent structural reforms that day one we commit to. The other thing is that we need to think about state power, building state power. Like one of the challenges is that states have the ability to preempt local power. So even on the municipal, and this is something that you all experience, on the municipal or county level, we could build all the power we want in the world, and then if we have governors or state legislatures that don't agree with us, and we probably do, then they could use all their tools in order to undermine us as much as they want to. And sometimes they'll even decide to dissolve whole governments or create new governments in order to dissolve our power. That's happening in St. Louis, where people are afraid of who might become mayor, so they're rethinking what St. Louis even looks like and operates like. So, and which just brings me to whatever gains we make, we always have to think about building the power to maintain that gain and defend that gain, right? And like whatever toehold that we have, it's only a momentary victory, and it's not like our opponents are gonna go home and say like, good job, you've won. The next step is they need to discredit. So it is actually essential for them to discredit CHESA so that the narrative could be that folks on the left can't govern, that folks on the left can't govern in this fashion. It's essential to them. And so we need to be prepared for the next step. How are they going to discredit us? And do we have enough power in order to make that happen? Which I think is, the last thing I'll say is that every single thing we do, we have to build base. Yeah. Every single thing we do, this is what the far right does. Christian evangelical churches are just political institutions that do really good political education, right? Which is why 15% of our population are white Christian evangelicals, 25% of the voting population, right? And so win or lose, we have to transform consciousness and do rigorous political education with our folks so that we will have a base that will identify these wins as their wins because they fought for them, and they will defend the wins.
That's great. Anybody else? You have your own mic.
Yeah. Did you want to go, Rachel? You can go first. So I agree with everything that Mo says. Thank you, Mo, for that. And I would just add that I think that we have to also begin to shift how we identify candidates, or how candidates really, because at this point, candidates identify us. So even on a local level, we have to really begin to shift the tide of how we choose we need to actually begin to choose who's gonna run for office, instead of them choosing to run for office and then saying, oh, can you support me? And so I think that's really important. And then the other thing is that I think that we have to really begin to shift our culture around understanding or looking at electoral work as work that happens during particular points of the year. I think most of us in here agree that we should be engaging in electoral work on or what we call issue-based work consistently, right? But we need resources to do that. And right now, for example, many of us don't get resources to move anybody towards an issue unless it's an election season. And so we really need to begin to push for, and even if it's not money, we have to really get into that dirty work of constantly, that tireless work, and it's not dirty, it's tireless work of doing what Mo said around shifting culture and consciousness of our people to be able to engage in actual developing policies around the issues that are impacting our lives. And so I can't push enough the process of looking at how do you develop assembly models within your space to actually do that. It's real simple. And so I just add that again, because those are year round. And it doesn't matter. We have to really move away also from this understanding that only people who can vote can be a part of the political process. You know, the assembly models that we use are completely actually it targets folks who can't vote. Right? It targets folks who are folks who have, in Mississippi, there are 23 felonies that prevent you from voting ever again in your life. So this idea, many people in our community say, I'm not a returning citizen because I don't have any returning citizen rights, right? You know, and so, so really beginning to shift the need for that. And so we engage folks who can't vote, folks who can't vote because of their nationality, because of their immigration status, right? We engage folks who don't want to vote because for whatever reason, they don't believe in the political process, but they believe in making decisions around the basic things they need in their lives. And we're okay with that, right? And we have to stop shaming our folks for not wanting to be a part of a system that has never been a part of a system for us, and so, really looking at that. And then the other thing I think we have to do is that we got to stop blaming Black folks for the inequalities and the systems of inequalities that exist here in this country, right? We're consistently depending on, you hear the narrative over and over again. Oh, all the Black folks are voting for Biden. Oh, Biden, it's all of these Black folks doing this, and then we get the brunt of that guilt and that pain, and that's we have to stop that type of liberalism. That just cannot be where we're pushing our people, and so we have to be careful of that. We have to be careful of that because we can't move, and I'm be quiet.
No, you don't want you to be quiet, but we want to.
I'm gonna
mix
just.
it up.
We can't move past where our people are. And, or rather, I won't say we can't move past, we have to move our people at the same time that we're moving to something new, right? And so if our people are not at a place where they understand why we want to vote a different way, and instead are voting around fear, right? That is definitely a white supremacist tactic, right? And fosters white supremacy. Then we gotta do the work to challenge that and to change that narrative. We have to do that work. And so I just want to add that. And eventually I want to talk about parchment.
Parchment, yeah,
Yeah.
we want you to talk about parchment. But I want to get a couple other people in. A footnote to I was at a conference yesterday about suffrage, women's suffrage, right? And I evoked the work of historian Elsa Barkley Brown, who talked about, this question of right after the Civil War, when Black people were participating in the new state constitutions, right? They had these large meetings, and they didn't go according to the state criteria for who could vote. Children voted,
That's
women
right.
voted, and the ballot was seen as a collective,
Yes.
right? It's
Yes.
something that was collectively exercised, not individually exercised. And I think that's the brilliance of the assembly model.
I think the only thing to add or just emphasize is that I think we are really indoctrinated in this country to think of elections as like electing our savior or somebody who's going to move our agenda, when really we're electing our opponent. And that change in this country has always happened because of a mass movement, not because an elected official just, by the good of their heart decided to do something, including, in the decarceral prosecutors, like that's because of that's because of the movement of that is like worked over the past decades to make mass incarceration politically toxic in this country, to the point where now prosecutors are like, oh, it's actually viable for me to push a decarceral agenda. So I think we're running a big voter registration program this year, and what we're saying to people is vote and then revolt. Like our goal is by November to actually be able to translate all the energy of the people we engage in the elections directly out into the streets. Because I think, if we look at Obama, for instance, I think part of the challenge with why Obama wasn't able to push some of the things that he ran on was because after we got Obama elected, many of us didn't keep protesting and didn't keep pushing. And I think even thinking about Amendment 4, we got the majority of Floridians to vote to re-enfranchise formerly incarcerated people, and then the legislature immediately went to try to roll it back. What would it look like if we had been able to keep engaging those people to occupy all the legislative offices, to keep that energy going, and to say, hey, and then 2020, we're gonna push for people inside prisons to be able to vote. So we always have to be thinking ahead, not only about defending, but how we keep pushing things further. And I think part of the reason Dream Defenders decided to endorse Bernie Sanders, we went through a 6-month process, our members debated all the political platforms of all the candidates, was really because we see the potential of a movement behind him. So we weren't endorsing Bernie as an individual, we're endorsing this mass movement and the potential of working class solidarity that we see in his campaign, because we believe that movement is ultimately what's gonna lead to the change and be necessary to push many of the progressive ideas coming out of his campaign, like eliminating student debt, reform of the prison system, and all of that.
Great. So I'm going to give Chesa and Mo an opportunity to answer this question, and kind of two questions together, really, outsider-insider strategy and the importance of keeping movements connected to electoral strategies and elected folks. So if you all have succinct answers, then we're going to turn it kind of to the audience to get some questions.
I want to add one last thing that, I asked people to hold me accountable. Barbara's doing a really good job up here, and she told me I was out of time, but I want to just throw out one more policy we put in place from the last question, which is that we prohibited my attorneys from seeking money bail.
Yes.
But
That's great.
But onto this question about about movements and the relationship between elected office and the movements that need to get them elected. There's a couple parts about this issue that are really important to me and that I see much more clearly now that I'm in office than I did when I was criticizing Obama or the previous district attorney or whoever it was. One of those things is we absolutely need to have electoral activity, movement building, grassroots organizing year round. This is not just election season, we win, we go home. None of that. I'm staying in campaign mode as much as, it's a challenge for our family, as much as it's, time consuming and energy draining. We need to continue to build space for the alternatives that we're putting in place. And that means things like on the very first day I was in office, there was a protest in front of my office from the No New Jails Coalition in San Francisco. people who I've organized with, people who I've worked with, people who I've strategized with, and they're out there on my first day like, how come we haven't closed county jail number 4? And I'm like, I love you, I see you, and I love you. Thank you for holding me accountable. And then within my first months, the Mothers on the March, a group of mothers who protest excessive force and officer-involved shootings and lack of accountability for police shootings, came into my office. And we had a long meeting where I said, well, here are the challenges. Here's what I'm up against. Here's what I'm trying to do. And they said, great, we're going to go on a hunger strike if you don't get it done. So that kind of pressure from the grassroots, that kind of continued mobilization is essential, because there is always going to be that counter narrative. Like Mo said, the people who are setting us up to fail, who are painting a picture, the police unions, the far right, the misinformation and disinformation campaigns began before I even won. And right now, we want to do restorative justice. We want to get people out of jail. We want to reduce the number of electronic monitors, but the alternatives are not there. So if we just say, well, the system's broken, we don't believe in the system, we're not going to participate in it, without having community involved in building those alternatives, then we are setting ourselves up to fail. So it's essential that we keep doing the difficult work of saying, what does restorative justice look like? What does it mean in a domestic violence case? What does it mean in a family sexual assault case, right? Taking those difficult outliers, right? We know that's not what's driving the numbers, but it's what's driving the policy and the narrative coming out of the far right. So we need to engage with that. We need to build alternative models, and we need to do it collectively so that we're doing the education work as a movement, not just one leader at a time, because it is a slippery slope.
Could I just jump real quick and just say, it's necessary, because without folks protesting or lifting their voice, you don't have the folks behind you to say that what I'm doing is what the people want. So I just want to say, like, that's also why it's critical for us to continue.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with more with everything said. The thing that I would add that we're experimenting with, so we're going to use the example of Philly. Now that we have an independent working families candidate who is sitting on a legislative body with Democrats and Republicans, what do we do with that? So right now, Kendra is engaging in a struggle around rent control in Philly, right? Now, she also has an independent political action committee that sits on our governance body at Working Families Party. So this is practically how the co-governance is working. So we're struggling together with grassroots rank and file folks from labor organizations as well as movement organizations. Kendra, she brings her own base, and so she brings her own.
The mood change.
You know, we gotta be ready for.
That wasn't a signal about that.
We're aggregating power. This, they control Con Ed. So, so what we're experimenting right now in real time in Philly is, what does it look like for her to be able? So, like, institutions are small c conservative, and people who are engaged in institutional power require order and require consistency and those types of things, which is totally anathema to the tactics of activists, right? And so even if you are an elected official who comes from movement, in order for you to get your job done, you're going to quickly fall into the institutional logic of that body. That will happen. It's not a question. It's like there's certain timelines. This is when the legislative season begins and ends, right? And you will tell your friends, like, look, this is when the legislative season ends. So it doesn't make sense, quote unquote, doesn't make sense for you to engage in protest past that point. It doesn't. And what also is true, what we've seen is that mass movements have a way of just sort of rendering insignificant those rules, right? And, and we've seen when outside of legislative session, they've somehow been able to marshal a special session outside of that time in order to deal with crises that were created by mass movements, right? And so I think it's important for us to engage in that sort of translation, because sometimes it's really helpful for activists and organizers to have a map of the levers of power. And we've had folks who have been legislators who have said, look, I just came out of caucus. These are the 3 people who are marginal, right? And it's good so that we know who our targets are. So, tomorrow morning we know whose houses we should go to wake up, right? And so that's information that we would never have if we didn't have somebody who was accountable to us in caucus. And at the same time, they're limited. They can't necessarily be on the front lines with us, and we need to have an understanding of that. So, the last thing I'll say is that with the Obama example, I think the problem was we had an administration that was intolerant of mass movements and that worked very hard to dissolve and demobilize mass movements. They kind of had the we got this attitude. And then the far right, when the far right clapped back with the Tea Party movement, they were trying to reach for a mass movement that didn't exist anymore because they demobilized it. And so we need to learn from that. And yes, as an elected official, some of those experiences will be uncomfortable and will be frustrating. And there will be times where you will say, what? Why do they not understand how this works, right? And it behooves you to tolerate that, because there will be times where you would need that disruptive energy in order to be able to in negotiations say, this is what has to happen. Look outside, right? And so I think it's always going to be, there will be contradictions, there will be negotiations, there'll be tensions. But I think it is important, though, if we're building a different type of model, there's a difference between us endorsing a good liberal Democrat that says they'll do things and us coming through our ranks, choosing somebody who's on assignment to do movement work.
Right.
There's a difference, and we should recognize that there's a significant difference between those two, and we should relate which means we could relate as comrades, right? And so we have to figure out what that looks like, and we have an opportunity here and in other places in the country to actually do that.
Great. Okay. We're gonna shift to audience questions. All right, ready to go. Okay, we'll start with this sister over here, who I know was on fire on the last panel, so I know you got some wisdom.
Well, I'd just like to make
By yourself also.
my name is Andrea James from the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. And Chester, this is for you. I just would like to set the record straight just a little bit around primary caretakers. So if you're referring to the primary caretaker bill that just passed in California, it's not the first primary caretaker bill that passed in the country. And a lot of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women are working in a coalition around this country. We got our information and a lot of our points for the model legislation that the grassroots incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women are working on in coalition around the country, from sisters like Ellen Berry, Diana Zuniga, California's United for a Responsible Budget, Critical Resistance, from the first SB 1266 many years ago that passed, albeit allowing the Department of Corrections to determine who would be allowed to come out. And we decided as a coalition of incarcerated women who were writing this bill to learn from those mistakes, and we resuscitated the process of a national coalition to pass primary caretaker legislation in this country back in 2015. And so I think it's important that we understand that when we move to pass legislation, how we do it. And the California process actually was commandeered from women inside of the California prisons who are working with their sisters in California on the outside to pass that legislation. And so, although we're happy that it is passed, I hope that you will at least go back and talk to some of the sisters to make sure that in its implementation, because that's a whole different phase, in its implementation, that you now reinsert the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women that were working so diligently on that bill. We just passed it in Massachusetts, we've passed it in Tennessee, and we have sisters in 11 other states, some of them are in this room, who are working on that legislation from the perspective of the women that are most directly affected.
Thank you. I'm going to take a stack. Because that was a contribution. So more than a question, I think you would say yes, probably.
Yeah. I didn't write the law. I'm just trying to implement it. I'm just trying to implement it.
Yeah.
Hi, Breon Wells, founder of the Daniel Initiative. I'm and also an advisor on the National Commission for Voter Justice. First of all, thank you for all the work that each of you are doing in this. My question, or kind of my two-part question, I agree with you that we need to stop shaming, particularly black and brown voters, especially since some of them may have held their vote strategically. Nevertheless, voter disenchantment is something that needs to be addressed. And so how should we address voter disenchantment? The other second part, I'd be remiss if at the Beyond the Bars conference, we don't also talk about both major parties have lacked to, across the board, address pre-trial detention, when we're talking about, so that information and access bit, but then as well to niche out this awareness for those who are formerly incarcerated. And so in 2012, the Obama reelection campaign was one of my clients, and in North Carolina, we saw a number of people who were asked if they were registered to vote, and they responded that they had a felony on their record, and people were just leaving that at that instead of taking the time to educate. And so do we have a strategy to make sure that we are empowering with information and access formerly incarcerated individuals?
Okay, I'm going to take 3 questions and then give people a chance to respond. Then we'll do another round. Right here, and then over there, back there. Sorry.
Yeah. My name is Chris Peters. I'm a Yurok and Karuk Indian from Northern California. I'm also the president of the Seventh Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples. As a group of people who have been subject to forcible acculturation into the dominant society historically, since colonization started. And how do we deal with the issue of the right wing and the left wing being a part of the same bird? You know, we're talking the same bird here. We're not talking anything new. You know, I like the working family concept. You know, let's bring something new into the picture. So your response to, you know, how do we deal with the same bird issue?
Thank you. So we're going to take, and you know, they are abundant in brilliance, but we're going to take succinct responses to the set of questions that we have on the table now. Andrea raised this question about, you know, honoring the work that's been done by incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, the question of voter disenfranchisement, the need to continue to empower or not block the power of formerly incarcerated people, and then the right and left as being 2 wings of the same bird.
Okay, I'll just go ahead. Okay, I'll go. So to answer for Andrea's question, one of the ways that we center our work is that our work is centered with folks who have been formerly incarcerated. Our organization, the People's Advocacy Institute, is co-founded by folks who have been formerly incarcerated. And then the other thing, Teron Moore is one of my co-founders. I'll talk to you later. I'm trying to be succinct. And then in terms of the question around voter engagement, so it's not an either or. Like, we don't have to shame people in order to bring them into an understanding of why, or give them a reason really to vote, right? And I think that that's what our work should be around, is like, how do we give people a reason? Or what is the reason that we're giving people? You know, what are those reasons that help them want to engage in that process? The other thing is, you know, we register along with our partners at Mississippi Votes, which is a youth-based organizing electoral organization, as well as One Voice Mississippi. We register folks inside of jails and prisons to vote. At all of our people's assemblies, we have registration tables for people to vote. We go and we do political education in nightclubs. We do political education in strip clubs and all these different places, because we believe that we should go wherever our people are, right, to engage them. So it's really important.
Yep, great.
I'll take the same bird question. So I think we absolutely need to have a North Star that is about essentially dismantling the current 2-party system and developing like an authentic democracy versus Siri's in the room. Put her on stack. An authentic democracy that has things like multi-party, a multi-party democracy with multi-member districts. And we need to think big. We need to abolish the Senate. The Senate doesn't make any sense. Just need to abolish it. It's not democratic. We need to abolish the Electoral College. We need ranked choice voting. And these are things that are possible, right? If we organize towards it, right? And so we need to be committed to those things. In the short term, we need to build independent political power in the current two-party system, which is what, so I invite everybody, like I say, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, the two birds thing's true. Organized capital invest in both of them equally, right? Wall Street invest in both of them equally. And the Democratic Party is a very nice limo, and black folks and our folks are basically like not in the driver's seat, we're not in the passenger seat, we're in the trunk. GOTV time, they open up the trunk, we go vote, they put us back in the trunk. So what we're trying to do with the Working Families Party is we have a Pinto, it's ours, right? And we're imperfect, but it allows for us to practice while we're working on those big structural reforms. It allows for us to practice the muscle of self-governance in a way that is non-delusional, a way where our people are actually winning. And so I invite anybody who wants to practice that with me to talk to me after the panel.
I just want to interject. Lunch is a little late, so we're going to go till 1 o'clock. You don't often get a note that says you got more time. So we have 13 minutes, and they're going to speak for maybe 1, and then we'll go to another round of questions.
I'm going to speak to the two birds question as well. You know, every local political context is different. What it means to be progressive, what it means to be radical, what it means to be liberal, you know, it's very different in Mississippi than it is in California, than it is in Philadelphia, than it is in Milwaukee, and so on. You know, in the race that I ran, there were 4 candidates, all of whom were Democrats, all of whom called themselves progressive prosecutors. And I made it very clear and was unashamed to be consistently the most progressive, the furthest left, the most critical of the status quo. And there's this narrative, especially right now in the presidential campaign, that we see about, you know, you need to run to the middle. You need to run to the center. That the only way you can possibly win is if you accommodate folks who are on the fence about whether they even support the Democratic Party or whatever the issue is that you're talking about in your race. We didn't buy into that narrative, and we won. So it's really important to remember that as much as voters may be issue-driven in some cases, they are also vision-driven. And when they see a candidate who is honest, who speaks from the heart, who speaks from lived experience, who speaks with integrity, they connect with that, even if it's not an issue that would otherwise motivate them to vote. And we need to uplift people who come from our movements and from our communities and have principle, not just politics. The other thing I want to just say, which I think is related, is that as we talk about what it means to be successful, as we engage with what happens after someone wins, right? What are the next steps? How do we define victory? We know, especially in the criminal justice space, that every failure, every mistake will be on the front page of the news, right? Every time we end money bail, somebody gets out and they commit a heinous crime, it's going to be all over the front page of the news. But the stories that are not going to get told by the mainstream media, right? The young woman who's arrested in a mental health crisis and is treated with clinics instead of cages, the man who has a dispute with his neighbor and is given the pathway to engage in restorative justice instead of incarceration, the person who's addicted but finds treatment instead of solitary confinement. Those stories will not be told by the mainstream media, but they will be transformative.
Okay, so we're going to take another round of questions. Let me just see hands. We probably can take 3. 1, 2, 3. And I'm just going to stick in one little thing myself, which I want us to sit with. You know, I don't know if people share this analysis or this worry, but it's also a moment. We have a lot of progressive people going into elected office, but we also see a move away from the rule of law in terms of governance, right? So we see increasingly a move toward more and more dictatorial and fascist type policies. At the same time, we have a little bit of power in the system that they made the rules for. They seem to be moving away from the rules. And so what are the implications of that, and how do we navigate that? Brother
Yes,
right here.
thank you. My name is Luis Quiroz. I teach what I do, and I do what I teach. And I'm an author of 2 books related to what we're talking about here. One of my creeds is that I have found patience to be immoral in this country. Patience as it relates to what we're talking about here. And I carry that, I don't even carry it to an extreme, because I even believe that President Obama was not black enough or brown enough, except when Trayvon Martin hit, and then all of a sudden Trayvon could have been his son. And I believe that I'd like your thoughts on the election that is coming up, that if it's not Bernie that wins, that there's an advantage to Trump, because Biden is so much of a neoliberal that because patience is immoral for me, and because in this country, until white people are affected, we see that with the coronavirus, we see that with AIDS, we see that with all these diseases, until a white person.
Yeah, I'm going to limit you with the time. I think
Okay,
we got
okay,
the gist
I'll
of
get
it,
to
and I think it's an important question.
That until white people get involved and are affected negatively by this creep Trump, that we really need to push the revolution and get the masses to revolt much more physically than we're doing it now.
Okay, something to think about. Who's the next person back there? I'm going to ask you to be succinct in your question, and the panelists will be succinct in their response. Okay?
I'm a little nervous.
That's okay.
It's all good.
I don't.
Get it over with. That way you can. Go ahead.
Hopefully it come out the way that it come out. I was formerly incarcerated for 10 years. I'm
Hold the
just
mic
coming
up.
home. I was incarcerated at 17
Hold the
years
mic
old.
up, brother.
I was incarcerated at 17 years old. I just turned 29 on Monday. This is my first Beyond the Bars conference. I wanted to say that I appreciate y'all. It's very informative, and that as a young man, we need somebody doing this work. And as many of y'all that's doing it. I'm from the projects in the Bronx, 169th Street, housing development. And we don't have voices out there like that. It's a lot of people that's conscious out there, but it's like no organization, no community centers set up. So it took me to come here, through friends, that I have the individual unique experience of this. And what I want to do with it is like I go back and just talk to the brothers and sisters in the hood. For those who gravitate towards it, I invest more time and energy into it. For those who don't, I still continue to plant the seeds. But my question is how do I get this message out to my peers and the communities where they don't want to hear this type of stuff?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Now, a bunch of organizations in here would love to have you join, I'm sure. Do we have a mic over here?
Yeah.
Oh, you running, I hear you. You getting her workout.
Hi, my name's Erica. My question was actually for Rachel, but also anyone who wants to answer it is, after the 2016 election, you're talking about transitioning, like vote and then revolt. And after the 2016 election, there was a lot of protests from people who don't typically engage in organizing. And a lot of the conversation was, if Hillary won, we'd be at brunch. And so my question is, how do we move into the realm of, getting people who vote to then remember they need to go out and still continue to engage, and moving away maybe from just reactive activism and like really producing new political environments, I guess.
Great. Okay, this is going to be the last round, so I'm going to let each person have a minute to tackle these questions before minute and a half. Tackle these questions before we have to break for lunch. You remember them all? Remember? Okay. Who wants to start? We don't have any downtime times. We
Brother, there's a New York Working Families Party.
They were recruiting you.
Holler at me afterwards. The Bronx. There's a lot of work that needs to happen in the Bronx. So I'd love to talk to you outside of the camera and this live mic about that. And I'll defer to everybody else for the rest.
Yeah, the questions were about the election and about a vote plus strategy so that people don't just retire after the election. And you can answer my question about fascism too if you want to. And parchment.
And parchment, because I'm going to talk about it. So I'm trying to wait
I mean, I had a similar moment in 2016. I remember I went to one of the anti-Trump rallies, and this guy drove by in a Porsche, and he's like, "I'm with you." I'm like, wow, what does that mean about this moment we're in? So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the resistance that came out of Trump, definitely lots of new people were politicized that had very liberal politics. And I think there was a tendency by some on the left to shame people with those politics, when really the reality is we need mass amounts of people, and we can't, we can't afford to just like write people off. We have to figure out how to move people to the left. And I think too often on the left, we like have this like, this race to be the most radical when, you know, we all start somewhere. And, you know, we got to figure out how to move people left, but we don't move people when we just write them off. So I think one of the big questions right now in this moment around Trump, in this moment where we have the Bernie camp, which is obviously millions of people who have, you know, who like are radicalized by his agenda, but definitely like, you know, probably are sexist and racist, like all people are, because they're socialized in this society. And I think there's a tendency to write some of those people off when really we got to figure out how to organize them to become anti-racist and to become anti-patriarchy and all that stuff. And we got to figure out how to be able to scale up political education to move those people. And I think our organization is constantly thinking about that. What are the creative ways to be able to absorb masses of people and then move them to the left? But it all starts with organization. And so I think people joining organizations and really digging into that and being in struggle is all about challenging each other. And I think that's what happens when you're in a membership-based organization is you're challenging each other. But there's really no way around that. We got to get to scale. We got to engage millions, and so it's going to be full of struggle and a wide swath of people with different politics that we have to figure out how to move left. Sorry, that was a little roundabout.
I'm gonna just ask Rukia to say something about the struggle around Parchment Prison, real quick before we run out of time because it's so important.
All right, so I'm gonna try to just do all the
Okay.
questions real quick. So, one really quick. Oh, Mike. Okay, sorry. So really quickly, Jesse Jackson said something smart the other day. He said that Vice President Biden was the white wing vice president for Obama, and without Obama, he's just right wing, right? So I think that talks to that. And then when we talk about how do we get to a place of revolt, I think we inform our folks. I mean, when we engage in the process of consistently informing our folks, we get there. So for example, one of the beautiful things about these caucuses that we did across the nation is that people really felt that it was the first time that they were having a real conversation around, one, the issues locally, as well as an opportunity to compare those issues to the candidate agendas. And people were like, why can't we do this all the time? Right? Like folks who have not engaged in like political process. So I think that one, and so people are like, now we can move, like I'm ready to move, more excited. So I think informing folks. The other thing is just to the brother who got up and talked about wanting to organize in this community, I really encourage you to join some local organizations. There are some amazing local organizations doing that work that really need you. I would lift BYP 100 too. I don't know if they're here in New York. You here? Okay, yay. So that's a really great
comes
one.
in handy where you know where you are.
And then as it relates to parchment, so, you know, I talked about the executive director of the People's Advocacy Institute, which is led and predominantly led by folks who are formerly incarcerated. Through our work, we've been able to do a few things. We've been able to create a Mississippi Bail Fund Collective, which is the first bail fund in Mississippi, period, where we just walk in and our goal is to end pretrial detention, but we also walk in and we pay cash bail, to the point where they didn't even know how to accept cash in many of the courts that we were dealing with. And that was created and led by members of our team who literally had experience being bailed out themselves or had spent time in prison. We also do work around violence interruption in this credible messenger program. We believe that we are responsible for our own safety, that we don't need police to do that for us. And so we have created what we call the Strong Arms of Jackson credible messenger violence interruption program, where we're looking at ways to really begin to shift what community safety looks like and what it means. So we look way beyond just physical violence. We're looking at economic violence and a whole lot of other violence. Then lastly, because, and this gets to parchment, is that we have been receiving messages from mainly brothers on the inside through emails, phone messages, social media, around the conditions and the torture that they were living through. And we have been receiving this for over a year. And finally, they said, I'm not going to just send it to individuals. I am going to risk my life because at this point, it's worth it. And I'm going to put it out there to the public. And so they just began to publish and post with their cell phones that are considered contraband what is happening inside of Mississippi prisons. And I'm not just talking about Parchman. I'm talking about all of the Mississippi prisons, right? Parchman is the oldest prison. It's the only institution that still existed after the Civil War. And it existed as a plantation and then a work camp and now, and then a prison. It has always been an institution of oppression for our people. So we are focusing our efforts on closing Parchment because it needs to be shut down. It has not been restored since 1983. The conditions that people are living in are horrific. And they're living in horrific conditions all across the state of Mississippi. And so we're not just fighting for the closure of Parchment, we're fighting for the complete policy shifts and changes and practices of how this system is operated. And we are moving towards having them all shut down, but we got to start somewhere, right? And so if anybody is really interested in learning about what I'm talking about, please see me afterwards or just visit our Facebook page, Mississippi Spelt Out, Prison Reform Coalition. We're consistently posting on there what's going on. We're consistently moving people in ways where they can help shut this down. And all of our demands and solutions come directly from folks on the inside. Every single last one of them. So I want to be clear that we are led by folks who are experiencing the suffering themselves. So shut down Parchment.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, that's, I mean, that's a note to end on. Are we out of time? Yeah, we're out of time. I don't know if you have one sentence to end or with, well, okay. One sentence to take us to the next.
We're in a united front against global authoritarianism, and we should act like it.
All right, thank you all. I think Kathy's going to come up and say something. And, you know, applause again to the organizers of Beyond the Bars. And Geraldine, Cameron.
You know, I was about to say something that was...
Mike.
Does that work? Yeah. I was about to say something that was a problem in our level of organization, but now I can say the food is here. I was about to say the food hasn't come, but the food is here. So I'm actually it's going to take a few minutes to set it up, but I'm going to actually turn this over to Rosie now, who's going to make a series of announcements. Okay.
Mike. She got one.
Kathy loves the mic, you know. I'm just kidding. Okay, so childcare, if you are in need of childcare, that would be in room 405. Community organization.